Hello. I want to bring a pause to talk about some of the ideas, some of the paradigms that are on uh, kind of the bleeding edge of what our culture is exploring and learning about human emotional and mental well-being. And the first thing is about shame. Shame is a cultural phenomena that reflects cultural taboos and boundaries. And when we do something that we have agreed in a culture is wrong, we as an individual in a mechanism of attuning to the culture feel ashamed of what we have done. For example, in our culture, it is considered shameful. There's even some very bizarre legal cases of 15, 16, 17-year-old young men and women in love with one another in a relationship sanctioned by their parents, being arrested, being persecuted by our government for being in possession of child pornography, which consists of being in possession of the mutually shared photographs of their relationship. Because we, in our culture, we don't attune to the emotional state, the emotional needs, to the organic processes of the individual. What we attune to legally are arbitrary lines. If you're under 18, you're not an adult, you're a child. If you're over 18, you're a child. This arbitrary line is attuned to varying degrees in varying cultures. You can drive if you're this, you cannot if you're this. It's not attuned to the individual state, need, or organic process within the individual in the way that, for example, if you watch a very beautiful documentary about the Thawi tribe in the Amazon, their process is attuning to the individual. And what they've found in explorations of a culture that has no crime, that has no police force, that has no violence, that has no rape, and little, if any, shame. In the Thawi tribe, the first romantic relationship is initiated by the younger of the two individuals, and is traditionally formed a little bit along the template that I chose as a severely traumatized young man that did not want to be involved in our cultural rituals of hurting and being hurt that are so rampant in young people dating today, whether it's promiscuity and betrayal, lies, confusion and overwhelm followed by an abandonment of relationship or an angel-demon pattern in which someone's the most amazing thing one day and then the worst and most useless thing the other. And these extremes, they're not intimate. They don't provide the ability to attune, to grow, and to learn relationship skills. And in the Thawi tribe, traditionally the first relationship is a younger person who's beginning to explore their relationship potential, somewhere between age 14 and 20, in that range, at their own organic pace, will initiate an interest in an older person of the opposite sex. And the role of the older person is to provide more of a neutral container in which the younger person can explore their full range without causing harm or panic, anxiety, or despair and need and all of that. Because that's an ideal environment. That's what a student needs. In our culture, and in this analogy, had Peter Sandhill wanted to be an initiator of my first homosexual experience, which, as an aside, I still have not had. That's not a goal. Then his role, if our culture allowed it, would be not to be charging money, not to turn himself into a prostitute, but to hold a neutral space, that if I came towards him, that he would hold a steady baseline around where, like a mother and a young child, I could move away, I could move towards, I could feel what proximity felt like and have an adventure away and then come back to the nest, and the way young children leave their mother's legs and then come back. And what studies have shown is that the safe and stable mother that is there, the child will go much further away from her legs and grow much more rapidly and develop a sense of self-confidence. The mother that pushes the child away when the child comes back is so unsafe that the child clings, that the child develops a clinging posture in relationship because there's no safe baseline. And so what the Thawi do is the young man or woman, at their own natural rate, there's no law and there's no police force, develops a bond and attachment in which they learn about themselves, what they need, what they want, what's comfortable, what's safe. They learn who they are. They learn about their impact in that first relationship with someone older. And the person who is older is of service in providing that baseline. And then later, the young man or woman, with kind of driving skills under his or her belt, will engage in a partnership with someone closer to their own age. In our culture, we describe this very intelligent and healthy process if it is honored, as illegal and perverted. As a result, if that starts to happen naturally within our culture, it's either secret and made into a shameful secret, or it is pushed away, often by the adult, scared of being shamed if a young person starts to express fondness or attachment outside the family system in some way. They will just be disconnected or avoided because we don't know what to do in this kind of situation. And if you can live in a country that would arrest its own young men and women for sharing nude photographs on their phone, you're not dealing with sick young and women, you're dealing with a sick culture. And this is my point about shame. There's the shame that any member of a culture naturally feels when they transgress a cultural boundary, independently of whether that boundary serves the country, serves the culture, or serves the individual. The shame is around the transgression of a cultural boundary. Now, this is important to understand because if you can say, when you feel that I'm ashamed of what I did, that either I transgressed my own sense of what's right, which is often culturally created, or I know that I transgressed regardless of what I think and feel. I transgressed a boundary that other people judge as wrong, as dangerous, even if it isn't. In Thailand, when Weepa was observed holding my hand by a hotel attendant who knew members of the government office in which Weepa worked. This, great travesty in Thai upper-class culture spread like wildfire throughout the network. And Weepa's family was shamed in a culture where this kind of shame is kind of the number one thing to be avoided. This kind of shame is to be avoided so highly that Weepa, who had never fallen in love in her life before, in her first relationship, threw me away twice in panic of transgressing this boundary to protect her family from this shame. And I felt devastated because who I am, how I want to express closeness, the way I need to feel safe, has been turned by a foreign culture into something dangerous, into something shameful, into something threatening to the woman that I love. And caught in this nightmare, she's going both ways. But one of the ways that she's going is to throw out. And so in her culture, she's transgressing a boundary that in our culture, we would say this is absurd. And in the Tho-e culture, they would say that we are absurd. They don't have violence. They don't have crime. They don't sexually rape and abuse one another. because their culture is more relationally intelligent and attuned than ours. So they would look at us not only as the immature ones, but as the idiots for spending $80,000 a year to imprison our own young people for expressing sexuality after the sexual organs have developed. To a Thoe, we must appear absolute, immature lunatics. But that will not stop us in this culture for feeling shame. And the other very important thing about shame is that it always involves a mixture of the community and the individual. So let's say that you're a member of a neighborhood, a close-knit neighborhood of Christian, 100 Christians. And amidst the addiction, the alcoholism, this and that in the community, there's 2 or 3 individuals that sexually harass, what we would call harassment, and someone is molested in one family, raped in another. And this goes on. Maybe it's not found out. Maybe the young boy who talks about being molested by his priest is told, no, we don't talk about that. No, Father Andrews is a good pastor. That's the church. We don't say that. And another boy is molested, and he's told the same thing. A young girl is raped by her father. And these are statistics within our culture. Our culture creates human beings that have a probability field, that whether or not you or I, on an individual basis, choose something different, that someone in our culture is hurt in that way, in a statistically stable amount. There's going to be X number of people in 1,000 who do this. There's going to be X number of people in 1,000 that do that. And whether it's you, whether it's someone else, it doesn't matter. The statistic is stable because it is generated by the environment. And what I mean by that is you get a packet of seeds and it'll say, if it's in the United States, it'll say, 98% guaranteed to germinate, or 96%, or 87%. It's going to give a guaranteed germination rate. And what that means is that if you spread those seeds in moist soil of the right type and water them, that you'll get, out of 100 seeds, you'll get 86 or more healthy growing plants. But if you take the same batch of seeds and you spread them on a desert and you don't water them effectively, there will not be a clear amount of seeds that has germinated. Maybe 1 will, maybe 2 will. In other words, it's not the seed. It's the environment. Does an environment produce 20 rapers per 1,000? 1, 2? Does it produce 20 addicts per 1,000, 50, 100, 500? The pattern lies in the relationship between the probability field created by the culture and the individual and the group within the culture. This is where the pattern lies. It's not existing as this self-contained sense within just a few individuals. If in a group of 1,000, one person commits suicide, there's probably 100 that want to. There's probably 100 that are dealing with the same turbulence of stresses and pains, but they're just not quite bad enough for them to go over the edge. But they're only in maybe 10% less stress and pain as the person that actually took their own life. It's a bell curve. It's a bell curve. And you don't just get 0 to 100 with no in between. You get a gradient. And that was just the person, that was just the one who's just had it just a little bit too much. And then right behind them are all the ones that are thinking seriously about it. And then right behind them are all the people that regularly have thoughts, this is so miserable, I wish I could die, but don't actually start planning it. Behind it, there's other people that say, why is it so painful? Behind that, there's other people that say, it's so sad to see all these people around me in pain. You know, I wonder if I'm going to make it through. I wonder if my life, like my friend, is going to get worse. Do I need an addiction to manage this? And that's what the bell curve of one person who commits suicide looks like. There's a whole host of people in the invisible trail and bell curve behind. If one person commits rape, it's speaking of a pattern of suppressed sexual energy, a pattern of frustration, a pattern of anger, a pattern of hostility that trails long behind the rape victim and the rape perpetrator. And when these things go on, what an immature culture does is it blames the individual in which this thing occurred. You chose to abuse that child. You are a bad person. We don't want you in this society. We're going to lock you up. We're going to avoid you. We're disgusted by you. You are the enemy. The individual is the enemy within an immature culture that doesn't understand the ecological nature, that we are a social species, that we are created and co-created by one another to a degree that runs much deeper than most of us are aware of, precisely because we are so created by one another that when we're told, as we are in Western culture, that you are an isolated free agent, it's up to you. Whatever you're doing is rational stuff that presumably is in your self-interest. So if you rape someone, it's because you thought that was the best way to meet your sexual needs. It has nothing to do with your history, nothing to do with being molested as a child or anything like that. Nothing to do with the fact that your wife, raised in the same culture, is so terrified of emotional connection that she does a variety of things but is always afraid when you have sex together. Has nothing to do with this, has nothing to do with anything out there. It's all you. But there's an interesting thing with shame, and this is, I think, one of the most important things to understand. That in this culture, I will be shamed for not knowing. I will be shamed for not taking better care of myself. I will be shamed for being too emotional. I will be shamed for caring too much. I will be shamed for not being more discreet about the taboo. I will be shamed for talking too much. I will be shamed for needing too much. In our culture, these are the cultural boundaries that I transgress to make this video. And these are the shames and the cultural taboos that maintain and ensure secrecy. They protected my parents' parents as they abused my parents. They protected my parents as they abused me and my 5 siblings. And they protected the culture. You know, I had one friend, one Christian friend, who took somewhat of a stand for me when I was 14, 15 to 17. You know, one of the few people who would listen to me. And she would listen to the abuse going on in my house. She would listen to my hate, my anger. And she would always make me feel flawed for feeling my feelings. She would talk about forgiveness. You know, could I forgive my parents? Could I see they were doing the best they could? Basically, any negative feeling that I had about the daily trauma, shame, and abuse in our household, I knew that she didn't want to hear that feeling, that she wanted the good Christian ethic from a 14-year-old. She wanted me, in a suicidal state, to care more about my parents in, you know, the good fourth commandment, thou shalt love thy parents, than my siblings or me. She wanted my younger siblings to care more about my parents. This is the protection of the abuser. The Catholic Church went on a little bit of a crusade to kind of, can we forgive Saddam Hussein? Not can we help or prevent the abuse. There's a protection culturally that sanctions, particularly the male patriarchal abuser. And yet, had any adult in my father's life cared enough about him, had my government, had the United States government cared enough about my father to send a health test that would help him see that he had PTSD, that he had deeply suppressed emotional wounds from his upbringing. Had our government cared about my grandfather in the Second World War, where during military service he was induced into a sociopathic state, which made him unfit to be a father. had our government cared enough about my grandfather, about my father and me, to do surveys. How are you doing after this war? What do you need? What are your relationships working? What do you need? Do you need understanding? Do you need a ritual? The Greeks, thousands of years ago, the Greeks, who were fighting a sustained battle on 7 fronts simultaneously, created the mythology of Medusa, the face of ugliness that was so brutally ugly that just looking at the face for an instant directly would turn you to stone. This is a mythology for direct exposure to trauma. This is borne out by the latest scientific research that shows that traumatic memories, 1, do not deteriorate, and 2, that talking about them or looking at them produces the same bodily sensations of overwhelm and panic as the original trauma, that just looking directly at the face of Medusa turns us to stone. And within the myth of Medusa, the key, don't look directly, look through a mirror, look through mythology. And so the Greeks developed the Greek tragedies to express to the community through the mirror of plays, through the mirror of drama, every single trauma and tragedy that every single family in Greek had experienced as a result of fighting a battle on 7 fronts that lasted more than 1 generation. The Greeks, thousands of years ago, knew how to understand and heal trauma to a better degree than my therapists, than my family, than my government, than my country, because we're Americans, and we know that new and improved is the way to go. We don't care about tradition, care about other cultures. We're the greatest. Doesn't matter what we are, whatever that is, that's the greatest. We're not going to learn from a culture thousands of years ago, and we're certainly not going to learn about feelings. That's a woman's thing. That's feminine. We're in a country where both men and women want to be like a man, independent, fuck 'em. We do what we want. No one's going to tell me what to do. And so we don't learn from the Greeks. And as I make this video, I've spent more than $100,000 US in Thailand and the Philippines. And I've taken more than 5 years out of the last 10 years off work as my coping strategy. Just discovering that without vocabulary and without knowing fully why, I could manage my trauma more in Thailand by a factor of 3 than I can in the United States. That I am warmed and supported by heartfelt connections here that I can't even experience with my $100 to $175 therapists in the United States. When someone is raped, what it means is that since they're almost always raped by an adult, it means that from age 0 to 18, a member of that community was left ignorant on how to relate, ignorant on how to meet their needs, was probably shamed and abused, was left in so much frustrated pain, ignorance, angst, hostility, and hate from their experience of the social protocol, that raping another human being made sense to them, felt good to them. This is a culture that doesn't see itself, that doesn't care enough to intervene in what it sees, that doesn't care enough to educate either its citizenry on how to avoid rape. It's often victims of childhood abuse who are raped because they are the least capable of asserting a boundary that has already been broken many times, that they don't even fully understand because no one in the culture intervened to protect them. I grew up around adults who didn't want to see the faults of my parents because they mirrored the faults of their own, because it would have taken time, because they would have felt like a loser, because if they had taken time off work and looked into what was going on in my family, they might have lost their job, and then this culture would have branded them a loser for taking a stand for an innocent child. They might have had to face the fact that this culture hasn't prepared them to deal with an angry child who hates themselves and who hates their children and who will violently attack anyone, believing that it's their right to hurt their child, because that's what the law says in our country. It's my right to raise the child. This isn't abuse. I took much more when I was young. Isn't that the problem? That we don't care to monitor this? And what I'm basically saying is that if something shameful occurs within our community, the shame is shared equally. If someone hurts another, shames them, terrifies them, traumatizes them, what that means is, for example, in $250,000 of work, not one adult, not one therapist, not one parent, not one government agency took the time to ask a questionnaire to discern the pattern. Not the hospital, not the healthcare center. So that I, as an intelligent, competent, successful business owner, using all the resources available to me that I know about, did not get basic information on my well-being. And that many people, as I wanted to talk about it, said, "Not now, I'm busy." Is that me, or is that a culture that is not interested in emotions or the consequences of not being interested in emotions? Peter Sandhill hurt me more than almost any adult has ever hurt me on 2 occasions. And of course, like a good American, like a good citizen, like a good Western man, he has beat himself up. It's all his fault, right? But he was trained by the Human Awareness Institute. He was told by the founder, Stan Dale, that he was a great facilitator. He followed their protocol. And that protocol did not include anyone seeing him clearly. Is that Peter's fault? Or is that something off in that protocol? They chose not to include psychotherapy. They chose to skirt the license. And he, like me, had a great experience in high and wanted to be a part of that. He came in not knowing how to help. But he was surrounded by more than 9 people who all told him he had what it took, who all trained him to varying degrees, who all recommended him, who all watched him in action for over a decade. And not one of them chose to be intimate enough with him. Not one of them earned his trust enough so that when he panicked, he went to them for help. Is that Peter, or does he know them well enough? Does he know the expediency within the culture to know that they're not going to want this? They're busy. They're running full tilt just like me. They don't want to deal with this. I'm going to just keep this under wraps. For Peter to have a secret in an organization devoted to healthy relationships and communication is not a reflection on Peter. It's a reflection on the organization. It's a reflection on the relationships within the organization. Peter betrayed Sarah by keeping certain things secret. He betrayed me and Sarah by sticking me in between them in their relationship. Which means that Sarah has to go along with a relationship in which either she doesn't fully understand and know her own husband, or she does know, but she's willing, she's attached to him, she's attracted and attached to him enough that she's willing to put up with an unsafe environment, with something that is not healthy, rather than challenge him and say, no, this is not right. You're not honoring our marriage. And as much as I'm attracted to you and love you, this is the line. You must decide, I don't care about the label, you're my husband. You're my husband if you treat me like your wife. And you're not my husband if you don't. It doesn't matter what the paper says. And if you need help, I'm here for you. If there's a problem, I want to know. It's very difficult if you're committed to seeing someone to either be aware, like, for example, I was aware by the time Peter stopped replying to my emails, by the time he's continuing to procrastinate. No one has ever done that to me that wanted a healthy, honest relationship, but Peter, my therapist, was doing this. This is, it's pretty blatant. And I wanted to find a way. I wanted to find a gentle way. I would nudge Peter, how about this? Come on, let's have some communication here. But sometimes that doesn't work. And that's when I did something that was, in Peter's eyes, absolutely outrageous. I went to his peers and I said, I described the whole process. I said, this is not right. I need help. I need help from you. You are the friends of Peter. You have trained Peter. You are the leaders of my community. You are my teachers of healthy relationship. I need help here. I'm in a more desperate place. I've never experienced this. I don't know how to take care of myself in this environment because I wasn't anticipating my body exploding and bursting into tears as I was driving. And that seemed dangerous to me because it tells me I've got a blind spot. It tells me that there's emotion down there that I don't fully understand, which has reached an explosive point that is endangering myself and others. And this should be a concern in a healthy culture, in a healthy country. This should be a concern of everyone. What if I'd killed someone? That's not right that they die because Peter doesn't have his training together. It's not right that I pay money to be abused because Peter doesn't feel safe enough to go to any of the members in his peer group because they will shame him, like the Christians shaming me for my hate and my rage at my parents. They will shame him more than help, because he's learned that in this culture, if he makes a mistake, there's something wrong with him, and he needs praise a great deal, like many therapists, like many healers. Many are addicted to the need to save, to praise, to be the hero. The superhuman shame dynamic. And that personality has a hard time. But that personality with an unhealed wound should not be a therapist, because they absolutely will betray their patient, their client, when that patient or client takes that person who's used to being the expert out of their depth. That healer will betray the client, which is why they can't ethically tolerate that wound without their own support network. What I'm saying is that no two individuals can express shame within a culture without everyone being involved. My father encountered more than 10,000 people since he was abused as a child. Not one of those people asked about his abuse. Not one looked at his erratic patterns that suggested to a clear eye abuse, trauma, and needing help. Not one of them cared enough to ask that stuff and see and take a stand for him getting help. Not one of them cared enough about me to say, Michael, you should not have children until you sort this out. Not one of them cared enough about me to say, Michael, I've watched you. You avoid every emotion. You've got this going on. You've got that going on. Something's up here, and I'm concerned for your children. Instead, all of those adults pushed away emotion, pushed what I had to say away. And my parents themselves, when I confronted them, when I talked about the fact that my siblings were well-behaved, honest, kind, happy, peaceful, non-violent individuals when I was babysitting them, because I deliberately broke the family pattern that I could see by age 14 and treated them like human beings. And they loved me for that. And I said, within 5 minutes of your return, they are delinquents again. And you are doing this to them by giving them no other way to get their needs met. I know a completely different set of siblings than the children you have induced. And I know how, I know why, I know how to do it differently, and it's easy. They want to be good kids. It's easy. And I can show you how to do it. And my parents were terrified. They said absolutely nothing, and they avoided me after that. And these are not drunken people. These are anthroposophists who sent us to Waldorf school. These are people that can't wait to read the New Age book of the month and blame each other with some paragraph here and there and then forget about it. These are people that were successful in business. People called my father brilliant. These are not the dregs of society. These are smart individuals doing their best in a very toxic environment in which not a single person took a stand for them throughout their life. And that pattern has repeated. And this is not anomaly. All 5 of us siblings are dealing with extraordinary levels of pain, shame, and coping in extreme ways. Despite, my sister has broken national sales records in several banks and department stores. One of my brothers, incredibly excellent mechanic and very competent, observant human being. These are very smart people, devastated for decades by a culture that is ignorant, that doesn't care, that shames the individual. And I just want to bring that context in, that people who are exhibiting symptoms of shame and abuse, shyness, inability to connect, low self-esteem, violent responsiveness, high reactiveness, protectionism, don't get near me. This is not normal human behavior. It's the fact that it is considered normal is a reflection of how sick we are. This is not normal human behavior. The Thoe in the Amazon, no flat screens, no cars, no technology, they're not doing it. They're living a much higher quality of life in air quality, water quality, sound quality, relationship quality, without violence, trauma, and abuse. They could teach us a few things if we were willing to learn. But are we? Are you listening to that and discounting everything that I'm saying? Oh, I can't just go off to Amazon. Who needs that? Well, that's some group somewhere. We're a country. This is why we're in the state that we are. We don't want to learn. We don't want to grow. It's not our fault. Someone else's. We're doing the best we can. But the reality is that these statistics are stable. The statistics of spousal abuse, the statistics of addiction, the statistics of crime. We have more of our population per capita in prison at roughly $80,000 a year. It's roughly 2 per 100. 2 per 100. In a neighborhood of 100 people, we can't figure out how to have all 100 people out of prison. We've got to send 2 of them at $80,000 a year. And we wonder why our economy is going to hell. We don't know how to help one another. We know how to blame and punish one another. There's a lot of people that are going to want to blame and punish Peter Sandhill. Or then they're going to blame and punish me for setting Peter Sandhill up for being blamed and punished when he's a nice guy and the best he can be. And yet, who's doing the punishing? Who's doing the blaming? A culture that doesn't want to look at the fact that nice, intelligent men and women are seduced into these cultural patterns because no one even wants to talk about them. No one wants to talk about them. The children are asked to go to their graves to protect the family honor when they've been molested and abused. Or certainly don't do anything sordid like let other people know. And that's how abuse continues. My sweetheart, when she was sexually molested by her grandfather and then by a neighbor, had absolute certainty at age 8 that she would be shamed by her church, by her parents, by her neighbors. So she said nothing, and these abusers continued. The abusers are not the problem. The pattern is the problem. The abusers are just one side of the same coin. In a culture that protects secrecy, that shames the individual, that blames the individual, and does nothing to educate and protect its population in a situation like this. I have chronic fatigue, exhaustion, a whole variety of things as a result of managing these symptoms, trying to cope with these emotions for 4 decades. There is not a single government agency in my country where I know where to go and can depend on for compassionate, loving support and health. I've paid $36,000 into health insurance in the last few years and gotten almost nothing for it. And yet I will have an impatient doctor who gives me 15 minutes to try and talk about this stuff. And she'll want to give me a pill. No, just try this. Come back and see me if that doesn't work. Or try this. Here's a $3,000 bill. Who wants to do that? And that leaves the alternatives. That leaves holistic healing. Human Awareness Institute, psychotherapists, one-on-one work with people that want to help, that know something. The trouble is it's not up to speed. Trouble is people are coming out hurt. I've tried 30 practitioners. A third of them made me worse. A third. And I had to pay them all. Because, first of all, they didn't want to admit that they made me worse. Peter hasn't ever wanted to admit that. He'd never even asked. There's no protocol to say, how did we actually help? No one wants to feel the shame of failure. And so this is passed to the patient. In our country, we shame the sick. If you had done your job right, you wouldn't be sick, is what we tell the sick. If you learned and tried harder, you'd get better when we give you the wrong medicine. If you give flu medicine to someone with gangrene, they don't get better, even if they have a positive attitude, even if they try hard. You need to give them the right medicine. And in our culture, in the mental, emotional body, in $250,000 worth of work, no one has even done the diagnosis. And this is the stage that I want to set as we continue this pattern, this saga that begins with me contacting every single one of my facilitators who I have been in workshops, that have agreements, that have recommended Peter Sandhill to me. and who are the safest people I know, because I've had the most sane relationships I've had, however crazy and stressful and traumatic some of them have been, within this community, within the workshop setting. And it's intelligent to reach out for help from an oasis of safety and more sanity, because while I was always told to keep it short, which meant that a great deal of this never got talked about, because very big patterns that take years to play themselves out don't sum up in little sound bites. That's cultural. We're a culture that likes to be efficient, and so we'd rather have 100 people say a few sentences than one person really be seen at a deep level. We feel that's productive. We had all 100 people get up in front of the room and all that. And yet some of these things take hours and hours. I have talked about what I'm talking about to you for more than 1,000 hours in the last 2 years, mostly to cameras and recorders because there's no people to listen, because no one wants to hear. No one even wants to watch the video. I mean, this is the shortest. My last version of this was 30 hours long. You know, I have 6-hour recordings going into the nuance of just one bit so I could make sense of why my body's feeling this way. So I could correlate this with all the books I'm reading, all the books that were never recommended, what I'm sharing with you has not been learned within the $250,000 worth of work that I've done. It's been me on my own, taking time off work at my expense to study because something's off here. And my life is in jeopardy. And something has to be done. And that's the state that so much of our well-being care and protocols are in today. That's not an individual, that's not Peter, that's not Dane, it's not even Hai. It's a cultural norm. Because if you think that a Freudian analyst would have done much better, I mean, it's luck of the draw, you know, who really has a good, you know, good intuition, good luck, etc. There's not, to this day, a single place or person I know where I can trust that everything that's wrong will be clearly identified and that everything that is done will be to my benefit. That place does not exist in my world, despite looking more than almost anyone that I know. So let's take the next stage and look at this pattern. And I just want to acknowledge, you know, that parts of me are sleep deprived. You know, there's bitterness, there's anger, there's depression, there's fear, there's shame, there's concern for, you know, it's unfortunate that to reveal a pattern, you've got to look at the nuance, particularly in a culture that is so insistent on denial. But to me, it's unfortunate that I've experienced the depth of this pattern within one of the most beneficial communities for my well-being in my life. Which, you know, so I'm not dissing the community, but that's the point. If this can happen in the safest, best community that I've known, after traveling the globe, spending time in various communities, it means it's everywhere. This is not a blaming of Hai or me or my parents or my grandparents. This is a question and exploration. What are we going to do differently in a country where we allow this to be just normal? What are we going to do differently when I'm considered one of the lucky ones?